also worked on she has also worked on more than 130 cases of abuse and violence with law enforcement. As part of her work at Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative (CHRI), Donita also built a collective of more than 50 organizations that advocated for citizens' rights to democratic policing. Along with this, she has also researched and presented multiple papers at conferences. Her research revolves around children and adolescents, violence and abuse, all of which we are going to be talking about today. So, welcome, Donita. Really excited to have a lovely conversation with you. Welcome to the
Hi, Aisha. Thank you so much, and thank you for that introduction. Thanks for having me and giving me this opportunity to interact as well as speak about issues that have not been spoken about. So, thank you so much for having me today.
Yeah. So let's just jump right into the conversation. I wanted to start, since it's Human Rights Day, I wanted to start by quoting Eleanor Roosevelt on human rights. She says, where after all do human rights begin? In small places, close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on maps of the world. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Without concerted citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world. So, this quote just reminded me of again working in small communities and small groups. And Donita, you have, as part of your dissertation, worked at studied a resident home of for mentally challenged at Mankurd in Mumbai, and you've also done multiple projects in community settings. So I had like a true two-pronged question to begin with. One was that what has your experience been of working in a community, in terms of mental health and otherwise as well? How has your experience been? And secondly, what are the models, structures that are currently present or available to the in the community setting to people? And what can we do to better these structures?
Definitely. Thank you so much, Aisha. So rightly quoted by Eleanor, the way you quoted Eleanor Roosevelt, it's actually something that is so true. The fact that human rights are not even seen on maps, especially places where one hasn't worked or it isn't important to someone else. Till then, a right is not something that is claimed on. My experience of working with communities has been nothing less than enriching, because people have stories and people need people to listen to them, and that's where our work begins also, as mental health professionals, as social workers, as criminologists, as sociologists. We believe in stories. We want to know more. We want to understand where people are coming from, their opinions, their experiences. So when I worked in the communities, it majorly was the urban poor communities, especially in the city of Mumbai. And uh, given the social demography of a slum population, majorly marginalized and an unorganized sector. So, say sectors that belong to rag pickers or domestic helps, or something that was not considered an employment within our employment mandates in India. So, when I started working in communities, one of the things that I did observe is the lack of uh, implementation of systems. Systems have always been present, and lately, so especially in a city like Mumbai, there are a lot of systems that are present, unlike a lot of other cities, because, of course, it's a commercial capital, etc., etc. So, when we talk about communities, these communities majorly had their health systems, they had their educational systems, they've had their protection systems in place, but none of them, or very few of them, were ever implemented in communities that did not matter. We also have to understand where it comes when it comes to people and when it comes to communities. It's majorly something where the systems will be active where people matter, and the systems will be inactive where people do not matter. Now, this can be we can discuss this on length when it comes to political will, etc., etc. So majorly the systems, or the reason I even started working with the policing system is because while police being the protectors are the abusers in most of the cases. But secondly, they are also the most neglected system that is not worked upon. So my community was not only working with people, my community was also the law enforcement. So how do I work with both was my idea of work. So when I finished my master's in criminology, especially in my second year of master's, I was placed in the police stations in Mumbai, two police stations where me along with my colleagues used to work as student social workers. Now, the reason why this was done was to understand policing system from the inside. What are the challenges that the system faces? What are the issues that they face, and why they are not able to reach out to the community, as well as the other way around. What are the shortcomings on a community-based level that do not allow active policing to happen, or I'll not put it policing because it's again a very authoritative term, but active protection to happen. So while that 1 year of experience of fieldwork brought about my interest in policing greatly as a community work, as well as a lot of community-based organizations approach their programs from a community perspective, as in we begin from the community, enter the system. Mine was the other way around. It was from the system to the community. Why? Because it is necessary to understand that we have a lot of biases, a lot of stigmas, but rightly so, about the policing system, not denying any of those. But also to understand that it is, after all, something that you need to work with the system. You need to give them to work something with. So you have to say that while we will be working with you, this will only bring about more of help to the system rather than just the community. So my experiences majorly revolved around working with civil society organizations that were already present in those communities. So when I finished my master's, I submitted a proposal of something known as public police partnership as a tool for crime prevention. When I opted to join the Criminal Justice Fellowship Program, that was the Center for Criminology at TISS had a Criminal Justice Fellowship Program back then, where certain proposals were chosen and would be supported by the center and by the funders for it to grow into an idea, a model, like an experimental model. So it was a fellowship program for 2 years, where I explored this idea of how a public police partnership can bring about not only a tool for crime prevention, but more of interventions within communities, and how it can be more of a collaborative effort than a state versus people effort. So that's when I got selected, my proposal got selected, and I started working at Nirmal Nagar police station in Bandra in Bombay. Now, this police station had its own political history, where a certain part of the Bandra community that was not the ones that were upper class or upper caste were now divided into another community, which was looked by this one police station known as the Nirmal Nagar police station. So the community surrounding this were majorly marginalized persons and vulnerable communities. Incidences of crime or incidences of offenses were greater, especially when it comes to domestic violence and child abuse. So my concentration of work began in the areas of abuse and violence right from this part. I'd like to retract a little back. When I was also working, when I was also studying, we also had a mandatory rural practicum that we had to go to under a certain topic to explore this one issue. So I also worked under caste-based violence as one of my issues in Gujarat, and we were there for 15 days, and we documented over 15 case studies in association with an organization. And that itself brought my interest in the area of violence and abuse, that how easy it is to perpetrate violence and how difficult it is to report abuse. So that's where my work, my idea of work began. And that's where my heart fell into place that, okay, no, this is where I need to work. Not being philosophical, but it is very difficult to find a place where you feel happy or where you feel inspired every day to work. It has been a difficult space to be in because while we do address issues of abuse and violence, the amount of impact it has on oneself is also something that needs to be considered. So when I continued working in the police station and around the communities, the police observed my work and they liked it. My work was acknowledged by the higher authorities, and that's when I started working across 40 police stations in Mumbai, because there were student social workers placed across all police stations. There were many other projects and many other cases that would go on from one police station to another. That's where my work expanded to 40 police stations, and in turn 40 communities around Mumbai, which is 3 zones. If you look if you look at the Mumbai police hierarchy, what I did observe was there were multiple amount of NGOs or CSOs working within these communities. There were NGOs that worked on environment, there were NGOs that worked on vulnerability, and there were NGOs that worked on health. Very few worked on mental health. Actually, if you go on to see, mental health was never an independent organization that worked within these spaces. There were organizations that worked on violence and abuse, and within that were counseling services. But mental health as an entire aspect, where if a person is distressed for no reason, for a reason that may not come under violence and abuse, that was not something that was being addressed at a community level. And that while that being said, when we talk about community-based mental health, I could see community-based mental health through these NGOs that worked on violence and abuse. So the interventions that would usually happen would be that when a person approaches the police that they are facing facing violence and or abuse at home or by someone, the police would generally, and now this would be majorly cases of women who are facing domestic violence, who have been facing domestic violence. The police would initiate a conversation with the person, and they would be sent to me, where I would be able to understand what their issue is, and accordingly then network them to an organization or an NGO that worked within the community. That gave the police a supporting hand, that they don't have to counsel victims because they do not have the expertise to do so. The maximum counseling that a police does is ki thoda adjust kar lo, things will be okay. So because they are not equipped to do what they have to, right? Or they are not equipped to do what others have. So that's when an entire model came up where the police could refer cases to organizations. There were relations with certain organizations that the police would maintain. So cases would be sent to these organizations so that the person is supported not only through legality, but through mental health, through a mental health support or psychosocial support. So counseling became one of them. Trauma interventions were something that I did not see on field in smaller organizations. However, it soon became more important for organizations to have trauma-informed therapists, or to have people who have studied clinical or counseling psychology. Until now, those people who usually were counselors in NGOs and CSOs would be social workers with diplomas in counseling. Not that you need a degree. I'll put that across. You don't necessarily need a degree to be a good counselor, but the point being that you need the expertise to do so. So these were identified by NGOs and CSOs over a period of time, and that's when a lot of organizations began having wings that had psychosocial support. For instance, Sneha is one of the biggest organizations in Mumbai who has a wing for psychosocial mental health support for victims of violence, for women victims of violence. Similarly, Majlis came up with one. A lot of other organizations, when we look at community-based initiatives, a lot of organizations came up all over India recently when it comes to mental health, and clearly mental health subject to be addressed was one of them is it is Atmiyata in Gujarat. So what the model follows here is to build capacities of community-based workers to address issues of mental health. Of course, it's a supervised model. There are people who have the expertise and the scientific background of mental health and mental health support and psychosocial care. But what Atmiyata did is they started identifying people within communities as who were community-based health workers or Anganwadi workers, ASHA workers, and training them, or teachers, and training them to be mental health, to respond to mental health issues. So not necessarily giving psychiatric help, but definitely identifying the issue and then making the necessary referral to various organizations or institutions that were available at that point. So this is one of the organizations. And apart from that, there are organizations known as Sangat, which also created the same model where they went on to do training of community-based organizations and healthcare workers on mental health to respond to issues of mental health, especially among victims of violence. They also provide affordable healthcare services in their organization, as well as they have tie-ups with government organizations and government institutions like hospitals and district hospitals, and that's where they will be able to do referrals. Apart from that, there has been a community mental health project in Tamil Nadu that was initiated, and that was one of the first initiations of a mental health project after mental health being identified as one of the most important aspects of addressing issues within a community. Then we had various other models, say, of telemental health programs or telementoring that started, especially during the COVID era, when COVID was at its prime, especially when children's issues had come into picture. That's when telementoring or telemental health services was something that was highlighted by a lot of projects across India. So there have been quite a lot of mental health projects or community-based mental health projects that did come up in the recent times, given the COVID context, more importantly, and especially after the mental health policy was brought into place. The first ever mental health policy was brought into place in the year 2014, and that's when people started finding it more important to address psychosocial issues or mental health in itself. In the last project where I was working with NIMHANS also, in the Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, it was a way to bring mental health in the communities. What we would do is we would train and build capacities of all child protection functionaries across India. So that would include the police, that would include the child welfare committee members, the counselors in observation homes and children's homes, social workers, case workers, legal comprobation officers, all of these cadres that come under the juvenile justice system or that come under the child protection system of the ICPS. All of these were trained by us on how to respond to mental health issues in children and how do you understand mental health issues, not in a way of giving a complete trauma-informed therapy, but how do you identify them and how do you go about addressing these issues and how do you understand these issues to further on understand the child itself and then refer them to needed services. What we also did in this project was to handhold a lot of functionaries who had children in their shelter homes, in their homes, and who were facing issues, who were showing psychosomatic symptoms, they did not understand why a child was behaving the way they did. So we handheld them in their therapeutic process of how you can. We gave them scripts of how to address these issues and how do you pave your way through a certain case. And apart from that, we also started telementoring programs. It was a telementoring service that basically got initiated under the ministry's guidelines of to start a telementoring service for children. So we would mentor the functionaries to help them to understand children and respond to their issues of loss and grief during the COVID pandemic. So these were things that have happened when it comes to community-based mental health care. It is an initiated process as of now, given the mental health policy, but not something that has been recognized as the most dire necessity. Now, when we also talk about community mental health, we also talk about affordable mental health services. We also talk about equality. We talk about equal distribution of these services. Sadly, very few organizations are able to give quality services at an affordable rate. And then the ones that are of quality are expensive for people who actually are in need of a lot of mental health support. So while we do talk about uh, accessibility of, or rather provision of mental health services and community-based programs, it is also important for us to look into how do we make it affordable. Not saying they have to be free, but to make it affordable and accessible for people who really need it. And for that matter, after the policy was passed, there was under the National Mental Health Program, we also have the establishment of DMHPs, that are district mental health professionals, who are placed at district hospitals, who are also supposed to respond to issues of violence and abuse. And it is a government hospital, so you do not pay amount of fees. And especially if you are from a if you are from a vulnerable, marginalized community, there are exemptions made even to that. However, DMHPs are psychiatrists or MDs or doctors who haven't uh, directly worked with children, or who may not have that approach that is necessary for therapy or therapeutic approaches towards counseling itself. So, in the last project that I worked, we did also work with the DMHPs, and we used to train the DMHPs on how to respond to child mental health issues and adolescent mental health issues. So these are certain models that are active at the moment in India. There are a lot of things that are happening across various states. A lot of states have taken up the issue of mental health, especially when it comes to children and adolescents, um, on their by the state departments itself. So they have started projects on how to address mental health among children. What are the certain campaigns that we can take up? So there was also one of the projects that Gujarat had was a Dawa Dua project that basically worked on community mental health development in India. So all of these are small practices that are happening across the country that have initiated a talk on mental health itself. Yeah, so that's where we are when it comes to community-based mental health services.
Yeah, thank you so much for a detailed answer. I think like there is lots to unpack here, Donita. Like you mentioned that there are systems available. There are lots of systems there, but in terms of the functioning, I think is where there may be some lack. You talked about your work with the police and how along with that there are also lots of NGOs, and there is this whole system, it looks like, in place, especially with protection of children. There is you have the body taking there is the body, then you have social workers, you have mental health professionals, and you have NGOs, and then you have police as well. And you also said something about how victims are coming to the police officers, and there is so much perturbation and distress there, but in terms of catering to that, there is a lack of I don't know, sensitivity, or how just to be able to give that emotional first aid to the victim is I think something that came across. The other thing was that you mentioned that like again, with these systems there is health, there is food, there is security, but the the need for mental health, I think, then comes below, or in the priority list that is there. And again, you also mentioned that it's so easy to perpetuate violence, but it is that much more difficult to report abuse. So I wanted to get into a little bit of that, your experience with violence. And I understand that there are multiple stakeholders in this situation. There is the perpetrator, there is the bereaved family, there is police involved, and there are social workers, case workers. So tell us a little bit about your experience of that. who are the different stakeholders involved. I also wanted to mention that, we look at police as there is this narrative that, police, there is brutality, and there is, more than help, there is abuse to be expected from police, and there is again abuse of especially people who are marginalized and poor, and they are corrupt, and etc etc. So how was your, and then you mentioned that there is also a lot of attention that needs to be paid to police officers and law enforcement as well, their mental health and their support system, so to say. So how is that for you? Can you tell us a bit more about each of the stakeholders and what that entire environment is like?
I'll do one thing. I'll take this into two parts. One is, of course, talking about the policing system as a whole and why they are the way they are at the moment. And then we will get into the experiences of how various stakeholders enact when it comes to issues of violence and abuse. And then we can talk about more on mental health of the police itself. So as we know, the Police Act that was passed, the Model Police Act that was is in the 1850s. So it's technically a very draconian law. It's something that still governs our police. Now, why was it made? It was made in a colonial era where the police becomes the enforcing arm of the colonizers or the people who are ruling the state, which is why certain powers and powers were given to the police to to be sure, like certain powers were given to the police to be the abusers to the people who are coming in the purview of law enforcement. Now during the colonial era, it was the Indians who used to come more in the purview of the law enforcement, given the fact that we were the ones who were considered to be the marginalized and who were the vulnerable at that point. Now, the surprising yet not so surprising thing is that these laws have not changed. They still remain the same. There have been more than 20 police commissions that have been made. There has been various guidelines that have been issued by various committees. For instance, let's take the most recent one was in 2006. That there's something known as the Prakash Singh judgment, if anyone would like to refer to it. Prakash Singh judgment is the latest one that basically brings about something called police reforms. What does it concentrate on is to remove the political power over the police arm itself, to enable the police to be protectors and not abusers, to be autonomous yet accountable, and to be more of people support than be the people abusers. So this was one of the policies, Supreme Court guidelines that were passed in 2006. Not so surprising, no state in India has still enacted all of these guidelines. Why? Because policing is a state subject, which means the central government has no upper hand over the police and the state. It is the state governments who have to enact or implement these policies. One of the reasons why the police is the way they are is because the policing system itself is very, very abusive among itself. There's a lot of hierarchy. There's a lot of marginalization. There are a lot of intricacies within the system that are not brought to the limelight because police has never been considered as a good subject, right? Police is the most thrown away system that nobody wants to work with, because jaisa hai waisa hai, we will not be able to engage with them, is the way we've always approached the policing system. So one of the reasons why the police is the way they are is also their training. When we look at the police academies across India and their curriculum, so we had this interesting 3-day thing. Me and my colleagues, we went to the Maharashtra Police Academy. The director there was very supportive in our study processes and said that definitely you can come and visit us and you can observe things around. one of the most interesting things about the police curriculum of training was that they had 8 hours of physical activity, and only the laws that were taught were the Indian Penal Code, the IPC, which basically means what are the punishments for offenses, and the CRPC, that is a Criminal Procedure Code, which means what are the processes you need to follow in certain crimes. But when you look at a police station, when you sit at a police station, the crimes that come under the IPC, maybe 1 or 2 that are reported in a day. But the crimes that, or the offenses that come under special laws, that are the Domestic Violence Act, the POCSO Act, the Sexual Harassment Act, or say any other act that comes under the special law, are plenty in a day. Now the police is not trained to respond to them. Their training curriculum was never designed to enable them to be people policing, but instead they were more towards crime and criminality. Right. So one of the reasons why the police cannot also respond sympathetically or empathetically towards a victim of violence is because they were never trained to do so. They never understood why a certain person is acting a certain way or behaving a certain way. What is the cycle of violence? Why a person who has been facing domestic violence for years and years along has finally decided to report it, and the question to then be asking them ki pehle kyun nahi bataya is not something that you can ask, and because they are not equipped to respond to situations like that. However, things are now going on to a point where a lot of civil society partnership has happened with the policing system. So civil society trains the police on how to react in certain ways. But we also need to understand, out of the 100% of our police force, 49% of the police is on VIP duty. 51% is the only police that we have, out of which only a smaller amount are the investigating officers, and even so the constabulary. So how do we then have a people police without having enough police, first of all? And then how do we have a people police without having well-equipped or well-trained, sensitive police, for that matter? So when we talk about policing as a system, the reasons are many. Not saying that they are you cannot defend the policing system using them. Definitely the policing system has to change. But these are the precursors to what happens and why it is happening within the system. Now that becomes one aspect of it. Second is definitely when I worked with the police, and when there were cases of violence and abuse that usually come, there was one pattern that would happen. I will quote more of domestic violence cases because that is one thing that I've worked greatly in, majorly when it comes to policing. When a woman or a victim of domestic violence would come to a police station to report a case, one thing is, very few of us are informed about police procedures. So we don't know the difference between an FIR. We don't know the police difference between an NC. We don't know that a domestic violence case is actually never registered at a police station. A domestic violence case is registered at a court. We do not have to go to a police station. How many of us knew that? We didn't know about it. A lot of people do not know about these things. So what happens is, generally, but the police is the first stakeholder when it comes to entering a criminal justice system. So every person would enter the police station. Now, when that happened, the police would first ask, "Kya hua? What happened?" So the victim would tell, these were the incidences, blah, 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 blah. This is how things have gone. And now I'm tired. I don't know. But majorly, the victim would always want one thing. I want the beating to stop. Now, it wouldn't be that I want the torture to stop. I want my financial abuse to stop. Or I want, say, usse bhi pehle, I want my emotional abuse to stop. But it will finally come up to a point where they say, I want the beating to stop. I want my husband to stop beating me. That's all. So what would be the usual response of the police is, they would call the husband or the partner, to the police station. And they would say, you shouldn't be doing this. You go and sit in one corner. Now this person will be detained for 6 to 7 hours, not legal. But they will be detained to 6 to 7 hours, not in a lockup, but just be sitting at a corner in the police station. an NC, a non-cognizable report, will be written, which is supposed to be written in a domestic violence report. A a non-cognizable report would be written and given to the woman. The woman is sent back home. 7 hours later, the man is sent back home, or the partner is sent back home. Now, when we talk about this, what has happened over here? There is no protection for the woman after they go home. There is no information given to the woman in case there is violence perpetrated again. What do you do? And most of the interventions fall short when there is no family or community support that happens. So a lot of times these victims of violence who come to the police station do not have family support, do not have community support. So they go back home. 2-3 days, things will be fine. Again, the same cycle starts. So what was the role of the police at that point? They were supposed to inform the woman that I am issuing an NC in case something more happens, or right now, if you want to report it, you need to go to these places. But that isn't done because it will only be another burden to the criminal justice system. Right? Now, when we talk about these things, that is where a lot of social work perspective comes in, or a lot of civil society perspective comes in, that we require people right there, waiting there to tell, to inform, to spread awareness about, where you could go, which system you could approach to. There was an interesting case where when I was working at a police station, this woman had come battered and bruised, okay, and she had gone to the government hospital, gotten herself stitched, and come, and she was there at the police station, sitting in the station house office. Now the police told me that this woman has been coming every month for the last 3 years. Please counsel her, hum log thak gaye hai, tired ho gaye hai, you counsel her. I said, okay, that's surprising that it's been 3 years and still she's not been stopped. There's violence happening, so there's some sort of issue here. So I was like, okay, I'll talk to her. She had 37 non-cognizable reports with her. 37 times she had reported to the police that I have been bruised and battered, and they were not small wounds. They were wounds that could come under the Indian Penal Code. Now there comes the second part of it. When it comes to domestic violence, it is seen as a woman's issue. It is not seen as an offense. So the police forgets that they can still report that case under the Indian Penal Code as physical assault. They forget that because of the lot of sociology around it, that to leave a marriage, it's difficult, to leave their partner, it's difficult. So these perspectives are not understood by the police and are not understood by a lot of the lawyers also, by the way. A lot of legal professionals fail to understand this, that it is difficult to report abuse in such cases. So this woman, when she came with 37 non-cognizable report, one thing I had to ask her was, what do you want? Because very few mental health professionals, social work professionals forget to ask the client what do they want. Instead, they would do what they think is right for the client. And that is where a lot of interventions fall short. She said, I don't want to live with him because if I live, I will die there. Now it comes an issue of, like the way I had to talk to the police was, if you do not intervene right now, you will have a murder case next month. So you need to figure out your way. You will have an FIR that will get registered. So while that happened, I had to inform the woman that there are so many processes that you could go to. One is, there is an NGO in the community that would help you file a DIR, that is known as Domestic Incident Report. In a domestic violence case, an FIR is not filed. A domestic incident report is filed because it's a civil case. It's still not a criminal case. So all of these information is something that needs to be given to a victim, to a survivor of violence who's coming to the police station at that point, which is not done because that's a gap within the system itself. Then the second option given is to go to protection officers that are available at various units in the city. Other option is to go to the District Legal Services Authority, DLSAs, that are available at every district around. You can also approach the Department for Women and Child Development, WCD. They have protection officers there. Apart from that, in Bombay, you have the special cell for women and children that was started by Tata Institute and now has been taken in by the Department of Women and Child Development, which basically has special cells in every zonal police station. So one police station in each zone has a special cell, but not necessarily that many. We have around 11 to 12 special cells across Mumbai at the moment, and then there are spread across Maharashtra as well. So they are given the authority to file domestic incident reports. Or if the woman or the victim is educated, they can directly approach the magistrate, take a DIR form, fill it and give it also. That's how you register a domestic violence case. Now, a lot of stigma around it. If I register a case, who's going to take care of me? Where is the money going? I don't want to separate from my husband. I want to live with him. Where will I go otherwise? Because a lot of communities that I worked in, where the man was the breadwinner of the family. So how does the woman then survive? She has to think about the children. What if mere bacche leke jayenge? Because a lot of cases that used to also happen, that where the kids were taken away by the family of the partner, that they are not safe with you. Other thing, the stigma was, how the hell did you enter a police station? Naam kharab kar diya, you spoiled a name. You shouldn't be entering a police station. So all of these incidences bring us to one point, that there are stakeholders. The point is of lack of information, where people are not informed, where stigma has not been broken down. The fact that police are still considered to be abusers, I'm not defending the system again. They are somewhere or the other still considered to be a difficult system to work with. However, things have to change in a way that our policing system is changing slowly and gradually. Stigma around violence and abuse needs to be changed as well. What happens majorly in these cases is families come together, they have a meeting. The meeting is more of a compromise where they say, ye agar aise act karegi, to hum aapko, we will send this person back to you. We don't want her here. No, hamari ladki अच्छे से behave करेगी, आप इसको यहीं पे रखो. So the woman is pushed left, right, and center. Like, I'm not here also, I'm not there also. Where should I be going? So she is obligated to stay with the abuser. She is forced to be staying there for years and years down. And that is how the cycle of violence constantly perpetrates. So there are so many stakeholders that we are looking at that can help a victim of violence. And they are present. They are very much present. The matter is of someone to connect those dots. And that was majorly my work in the police stations. I used to connect those dots of where you could go, what you could do. The student social workers would do the same things. We built a model out of it. We wanted to institutionalize it, but it didn't happen at that point. So when we talk about violence and abuse in the context of domestic violence, now there are other aspects when it comes to child abuse or sexual abuse. So the gap being lack of information and lack of will itself, and stigma and stereotype around the issue of violence and abuse. Now, when we talk about violence and abuse, now understand this, that the police is someone who works more than 18 hours a day with lack of sleep, no proper food. A lot of police also do not have great family lives because they do not have time to spend with their people, with their persons, their families. That only causes more mental trauma and mental stress. So how does the police deal with it then? For a common person outside the police force to even approach a mental health service, they will think 10 times, because what if people label me as a mad person? What if people label me ki, "Arey, why do you need mental health service? This depression and all is nothing." The usual talks that go around, the stigma that goes around mental health, a person outside the policing system would think 10 times to approach a mental health service. Except people who are informed, like people within this group or community. We are informed. It took us time also, let's say. But other people, it takes 10 times more. For a police person, a person who is supposed to be all strong and all amazing, and a person who is supposed to protect people, how the heck can they be weak? Now, this stigma stops the police themselves to approach mental health services. Interestingly, in one of the times when I was a student social worker, I had this think that, I want to see where mental health service for the police is. So there's this police hospital in Bombay. They have a mental health service. So they had put a small notice on a notice board at the police station that if you're facing any issues, you can approach us. Great initiative. Problem was that the police hospital counselor was never approached. Why? Because of these stigmas. Also, the availability of the counselor was not every day. So how do we ensure that there's police mental health also that has to be considered? A lot of police who have either been a part of extrajudicial killings, who have been a part of homicides, who have been a part of crimes themselves, do face PTSD, have experiences of anxiety and depression, have issues that relate them to, degrade their performance within the police force itself. The mental health of police became a highlight after an IPS officer shot himself dead at a restaurant, and the entire aspect of the stress that an IPS officer faces. And also one more incident of two investigating officers or PSIs hung themselves at a police station because of the stress in a particular case. The issues they were facing were never considered. This was when a lot of talk about mental health among police professionals also came into picture. It gradually died out. We do not talk much about it because we also need to see that mental health services are for everyone. Now, wherever it is, a police can definitely approach a district mental health service. A police can definitely approach an NGO that gives mental health services. But the stigma and stereotype around it is something that stops them from doing it and something that needs to be worked on. So a lot of police leadership now have taken this up. A lot of informed police leaders of the IPS cadre mostly have taken it up on informing their police forces that, if you are in matters of stress and anxiety, you can definitely approach these services. They are available to you, and you take them and they will be free for you, because there is a yojana also that governs it. So yeah, but widely so, the police mental health is not something that is yet considered, nor does the policing system consider it as an issue. So yeah, so that's where the entire scenario of stakeholders, the violence abuse cycle, and police themselves stand at this point.
Yeah, a couple of things here. One thing that you mentioned about DIR and FIR, I was quite surprised by, because you also said that these are women's issues or special problems or complaints. So it feels like the whole, I mean, it sounds like that violence in the home sphere, or what was said, civil matters. It feels like there's another protective layer that you have to cross to, just for a woman or a child to make that complaint. And it just I mean, you can just see the whole the gender disparity is so strong and so visible here, and it has such strong impact, where everybody is, even here where you talked about, in the training, the police is learning what is the crime and what is the process that I have to follow. So even when this woman is coming to them, they're just saying, "Acha, this is the crime, and this is, now you can go back home," and they're sending them back to the abuser. It's just so absurd and sad, So just a rant here. Besides that, you also talked about, I was also thinking that you mentioned that there is hierarchy, and then there is marginalization, and I was thinking about the mental health of police and suicidality, and how when there is such strong hierarchy, there are definitely people who are there on the margins within the policing setup as well, and just what happens to the mental health. And it also made me think about the police community in itself, because they're not going home. they're not getting that human connection with their families at least. So it just made me wonder about just that brotherhood amongst the police members as well, and then again women police officers, and that whole, it's so nuanced and complex in that
Yeah,
sense.
it's very complex. And if you look at the policing system when it comes to marginalization, it's another whole world to look into, because the number of women police officers at the moment is highest in only two states, Maharashtra and Kerala. That is also still not the highest. It's very little. It's hardly 11% of the total police force.
Right.
And if anyone is interested, you can look at the recent report of the India Justice Report that was released in 2020. It gives proper divisions of each state, their the SC/ST category of it, the number of women police officers, the number of women police officers within SC/ST, or the number of SC/ST police personnel. Where are they? What is the ranking? How much is the service given to them? All of this has been highlighted in that one report. So if anyone is interested, you can definitely go through that.
Yeah, thank you. So I think we've talked about the police and we've talked about the victim to some extent. So let's talk about you. Let's talk about the social worker as well. How is this entire thing for the social worker? What are the stigmas that you have to face or deal with, whether it is building trust with the bereaved families, or forming that rapport with the police, and how are the working conditions for social workers?
So there was something very interesting that happened when I started working with the police. Okay, they would constantly say this one thing: "अरे आप तो social worker है, आप इतना पढ़ाई क्यों कर रहे हो? आप तो social worker है, आप इतना पढ़ाई." Because the concept around social work was charity based work. If there is a person, a rich person who wants to give money, they would do social work. It is one way of social work, not saying no. Second is, if there is a person who is into party politics, and vasuli ka kaam also. If you look in the Mumbai terms, it's vasuli means take getting money from people who have taken it. That is also called social work in local terms in community work. So when I used to go to the police station, they would be like, "Why are you studying so much? You want to be a social worker? No, so you can just be a social worker. Join these people." So first ever challenge that I and my colleagues had to face at a police station was to break the myth about who is a social worker and what is social work in general. So one aspect was कि party politics है, means they are a part of some Sangh or some politics or some party that they are a part of, and that is why they are doing some social work. Other is if they have a lot of money, they are doing social work. And third is that they hate us, that is why they are helping victims. Now these three situations were really difficult to go through or intervene with. So what we had to do were a lot of conversations and informing, or taking up this entire aspect of what actually is social work and who is a social worker. One of the major challenges that we did face is when we used to support victims, we couldn't go against the police, because that's when we would break a built-in relationship with the police. Not saying that I didn't treasure it. I have met amazing police people and I have met amazing police officers, and they have my heart for the work they've done. But it is also a matter of conflict of interest. Where is your interest? Which is your side? So choose your side was the option given. So it was quite a deal when I had to deal with the victims and survivors of violence who would come and say, "Mera FIR register nahi ho raha hai." And now how the hell do I go to the police and say, "Why aren't you registering an FIR?" Because I know they wouldn't do that if I had to. So there were ways in which I had to talk to them, and I had to speak to them to give them a rationale of why it is important at the moment to file this FIR, and if it is escalated, where it could go and what would happen. So another thing was, while you work with any system, there is a fear of being co-opted into the system. And co-option is a huge dilemma when it comes to working with systems like working with the criminal justice system, because you have so much power. You have so much authority around you that you can easily get co-opted into a system. So when we were in, or especially when I was in the police station, it was easy for me to say, "Arey, मैं इसको phone लगा दूंगी, things will be fine." But that's not something I'm supposed to do, because it will only make me another police officer. But I don't have to be that. I have to be the social worker. So how do I maintain the fact that I will work with the police, but I am not the police? I will work with the people, but I'm not against the police. So this gamble was sort of a very difficult one, which took me 2 years to break down. So in my second year of masters plus first year of my fellowship, it was only that gamble that I had to deal with, was who am I? First of all, what is my identity in this place? What is the identity of people around me? Who are they to me? And how much can I help them, and how much can I work with them? So there were also instances where victims would come and say, आप बड़े साहब को जानते हो ना, you know the person on the top, right? So just call them up. And but I couldn't do that, because that would be flaw of process. I had to tell them that is something I could do, but I won't do, because that is not the process, and I go by process. Now there were other instances where there was a lot of issues when it came to certain high profile cases where there was corruption involved. So there was money that was being offered, but how do I take an ethical stand on it? That no, not saying that I will go and say that you've taken money, but I'll say that I don't want it. Rest is your choice. You know that it is illegal. Rest is your choice. It was a dilemma every day. Some days I would see some person, a victim of substance use, being brought to the police station and being beaten up. And I didn't know what to do, because I knew at that point, if I said anything at that point, it would only mean that I could not work more. So what would I do is usually have a conversation again with the police person who did that. And they would have one thing to say, "Madam, it was not my decision to take. I was told to do that." Then how do I intervene in that aspect? How do I understand? It only made me learn more about the policing system. There were a lot of constabulary who never wanted to do things that they had to do, but they, to keep their job, to keep themselves, and to keep themselves safe, they had to do certain things that involved that involved physical abuse within police stations, that involved corruption, that involved a lot of things. Not saying that it didn't happen in front of my eyes, it did. Gradually, however, after conversations, after understanding work, after explaining my perspectives, things reduced. And that is one thing I was always proud of. In one of the police stations that was the most unapproachable police station became one of the best police stations for people to approach. There were so many things that happened in that police station, where one is people could understand the police structure, because we put out an entire map of the police station. For what work do you have to go where? People should not be lost. Simple things like that. Second is your rights within the police station. So DK Basu guidelines, something that needs to be put out in a police station, was not put out. But along with the leadership at that point when we worked, they were more than happy to do that. Third is having conversations with the police themselves to understand them, their experiences of what they went through. And, giving them a perspective that social work is not only for people outside police station. Social work is also for people within the police station. So then it turned out to be that police officers or people in the police station would come to me and talk to me about whatever is happening, or not only problems, just general issues. There was one constable who needed 25 lakh rupees for his son's operation. So it was another way of activating CSRs or activating the Yojana to help the constabulary, and it happened. So they kind of saw me as a friend, yet not a friend, yet someone who they have to understand that we cannot cross lines. And people also understood that I'm not the police. That is one thing I had to clarify every time I had the conversation with a victim or a person who approached the police station, that I am not the police. I work with them, but I don't work for them, and I work for you. And that is where I am going to take my perspectives from. What help you need would be something I would try to give my best in. So these were sort of a lot of challenges that I faced as a social worker within police stations. Then comes this entire aspect of dealing with issues of violence and abuse. Because every day, even I used to pull 32-hour duties, 24-hour duties along with the police. I used to spend day in and day out on that one bench at the police station that was given for me. There was no chair or anything. There was one bench, one wooden bench that was given where I would usually sit. I used to hear conversations, I used to hear cases, I used to hear narratives, I used to hear experiences every day. And that sort of causes a lot of impact and you don't realize it. Over a period of time, definitely I realized it. And because I had a great mentor whom I could speak to at that point. So one thing is to keeping a check on yourself becomes very important as a social worker, as a case worker, as a mental health professional. Keeping a check on yourself of how you are doing. On some days you may not be feeling that well. You can definitely respond to a situation, but ask the person that see if anyone else could respond to that instead of you. So these were some difficult choices also that I had to make, where at some points I had to give up certain cases because I couldn't take it. I couldn't handle my stress at that point to now take on a narrative that would impact me. But I wouldn't let the victim go or the survivor go without support. How do I help them get another sounding board? How do I help them get another person whom they can hear, whom they can speak to? So my focus was not constantly working with people, but connecting them to others also, because I knew that I could only do so much. As one person working across 40 police stations, you cannot, each police station has 100 cases a day. How can you then work on 4,000 cases in a day? It just doesn't make sense. So my model was usually referral and pre-counseling, what you call it, is where we inform people of the processes that are involved and what would happen there. So you can approach this place. Now, if there were certain cases that I was involved in where I would take care, I would ensure that things were written down by the victim or the survivor so that I don't have to tell them to repeat it, and I don't have to constantly keep reading or hearing it again and again. I can read it once and for all, and that's my information for the day. So as a social worker, it becomes very important to keep a check on your mental health. Secondly, to keep a check on your safety. Where are you going? What are you doing? Somebody has to be informed about your whereabouts, because you are, while working with the policing system, you're dealing with a lot of people around you. You're dealing with not so good people around you. And how do you then ensure that you are safe when you're returning back home, when you're walking down that lane at night, when you're leaving the police station, when you're entering the police station? How do you ensure that you are safe? So keeping someone constantly informed about your whereabouts was something that I had to do. And that was something that most people who work with the police or with difficult, not only with the police, even in communities that are difficult and on issues that are difficult, say caste-based violence, it becomes very important to do certain things to pull that one line where you are safe, so that you can continue to work further. You do not give up on yourself at that point. So as a social worker, one of the major things was, first of all, breaking the stigmas or around social work. Who is a social worker? Identifying myself as who am I, who are the people around me, and whom do I help. Third is creating boundaries of where can I be a part of the police and where can I not be a part of the police, while working with the police, not being co-opted with them. Where I shouldn't be an enemy to the police and not an enemy to the people. So creating that one space for myself, then ensuring my own safety of my own well-being, my own not only physical well-being, but mental well-being as well. So all of these were certain things that I had to look at in the 4 years or 4.5 years of working with the police. And it has made me nothing but stronger, and it has helped me gain so much perspective of where I stand, especially when I work with systems. When you work with a lot of multiple systems, say government systems of judiciary or legal aid services, how can you pull those boundaries and how can you maintain them? That's a skill set that I gained via experience, but definitely something that took 4 years to develop. So it takes a lot of time. And yeah, so I think people who would love to join the work of or join social work in criminal justice spaces have to be informed about creating these boundaries and self-care activities as well.
Yeah. I think what you just said made me think about paranoia, because if you're constantly looking over your shoulder and there is that safety that you have to take care of, I feel like there is a sense of paranoia that can set in, and how normal that can be. And the other is this because your job is demanding you to help someone, you have to help. That part of I don't know, like somewhere there is some sort of a sacrifice that you're making um, in being there for somebody. And then again there is that paradigm, and then there is the other where you have to take care of yourself, and drawing boundaries at so many levels here.
And also there's something interesting when you spoke about that. A lot of times while we are doing that, because we're dealing with abuse and violence every day, there is an aspect of normalization that occurs within social workers and case workers who are constantly listening to stories of violence and abuse. They're like, ठीक है ना, कल देख लेंगे. Okay, no, we'll respond to tomorrow. That's okay. Oh, इतना ही हुआ ना. This much only happened. No, so it's okay. So there is a fear of normalizing the phenomena of violence and abuse. So keeping a check on that is also important. Am I normalizing this? Because trauma is trauma, be it anything. So how, because you're seeing it every day, police also for the same matter, you're seeing it every day. It's just normal for you. So the same thing happens with a social worker or a caseworker working within systems of violence and abuse.
Makes me think that if this is not normal, like almost like sometimes you can even trivialize this.
Yeah.
Choti si baat hai. But if you are not normalizing it, then what happens on the other side? I mean, like if you're constantly exposed to this, even for the police people, especially working on the field and seeing abuse happen, violence happen, if that sort of I'm not sure, I can't use the right word, but if that numbing effect is not coming in, then what is the result of that?
There are two things. One thing is you cannot be overly sensitive to everything that it impacts you greatly. Other thing is you cannot be numb to it, because then you will not work empathetically. So how do you create that one space where you're sensitive, empathetic, yet careful and objective of how much can you do? So you one thing I always, whenever I do trainings also, one thing I always highlight is, you cannot save everyone, and you are not God if God exists. So you are not God. So it is okay for you to say no sometimes. It is okay for you to pull that one line behind and say कि नहीं, मेरे से नहीं होगा, I don't want to do this at this moment. It is fine. You cannot give your entirety to something, and that is just asking for too much. If that is something that somebody is asking of you, that's just too much of asking. And it is okay that you pull that boundary, that no, I do not want to respond at this point, I will respond later. A lot of therapeutic approaches, or even recently a lot of people who are joining the workforce for that matter, have forgotten that it is okay to pull boundaries. And I was one of them, let me be honest, but it is okay to pull boundaries. And it is okay to say, I cannot do this right now, it's fine. But there has to be a balance. When you are saying that this is normal, ye to chalega, meko farak nahi padta, then it is a problem, because you will not work. You will not be able to give that bit of yourself that you're supposed to give in every case. You will not give that bit of yourself, that effort to be made to be there for that one person. But other way is that, oh my God, I will be there for you 24/7. I will do everything for you. Now that's problematic again. That you cannot be that also, because if you do that, you are not building the capacity of your client. You are rather being their capacity. So how do you pull that line of where You are teaching the man to fish so that they can eat all their life, but at the same time you are understanding where they're coming from and not saying कि मुझे कुछ फर्क नहीं पड़ता, you deal with your own thing. So you have to understand this one line of one space where every statement you speak, every case you are taking, there is an aspect of introspection that needs to happen. So every time you deal with a case, say I'm talking on case level, I'm not talking on community level, but when you're talking about individual level, you're dealing with one case, you're supposed to have a conversation with yourself every time, and a level of introspection needs to happen, that what are you going to say, and what you said, how does it imply, and what are its implications. If this happens, what should you be doing, and how much can you do? All of these are questions you need to ask yourself before you take a stand on any case, on any issue, or any person you're dealing with, for that matter. So there has to be an in-depth level of introspection that any social worker or case worker has to do to understand that space, that where they're not completely numb, but where they are not completely overdoing it. An empathetic, sensitive approach is necessary, and to work with your client at the same time to improve their capacities to deal with it. That's what we do in therapeutic processes also. We do not be there for the client in, like, completely right there that I will do your things, but we help the client do it by themselves. So that is also related to every social work process and social legal process also. I will not handhold the client everywhere I go to a court or to a police station or anything. What I will say is, I have come with you so far. Now what you have to do is, you can go to this person. If you have any issues, I'll be there. But you have to do it by yourself. So you're not completely numbing yourself that I don't care what you're going to do henceforth because I did so much for you. But you are saying that I am here for you. Only thing is, now you have to be there for yourself as well. So you move ahead. So you pull that one space, that one line, and it comes only with in-depth introspection. There is a lot of introspection that goes into such processes.
Right. It sounds like a very fine line to balance in that sense.
Yeah.
Definitely. Okay, so I think it's 9:15. If you like, Dunita, we can take a small break and then continue the conversation.
Definitely. So we can take a 2-minute break or 5-minute break. What do you?
Sure. Yeah, we can take a 3-minute break maybe.
Awesome. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'll see you in 3 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. Welcome back, Dunita and everybody. Okay, so let's talk about you, Donita. You completed your graduation, and then because social work is not is, I guess, a more unique choice or not part of the norm, so to say. So what motivated you to pursue this for your masters and then ahead?
I have a case of a roller coaster ride when it comes to my career. More of where what interests me, I went towards that. But I'll retrace it a little back.
Yeah, please.
So I was brought up in a very middle class family, which basically wanted me to be a doctor, and my brother to be an engineer. But rightly so, I had a lot of interest in sciences, and I also for the longest time wanted to be a doctor, wanted to finish my MBBS and study MD, or be in the medical sciences. What was different for me was that also was something that got inculcated in me as a part of service, as a part of, say, not serving, but as a part of giving back to the community or giving back to the people itself. I didn't know of any other options of how to do that. Right. So as in when I was growing up, I knew that I wanted to be a doctor. So I studied well, I studied for my sciences, all of these things. But during my junior college days, I understood that MBBS, I would love to study it, but it is not my cup of tea. Like, I don't want to spend 5-6 years of studying so much and then working. That's not something that I want to invest in, honestly. And I was obsessed with psychology at that point, but I was a science student, and now to move to psychology was difficult, given the Mumbai University guidelines and all of these things. So at that point, one thing that came to my rescue was a midpoint for me to be in sciences and yet pursue psychology was through forensic sciences. So the college had that I joined, that is Institute of Forensic Science in Mumbai, was one of the first colleges that started a graduation course in BSc in Forensic Sciences that offered 6 courses, one of which was forensic psychology. That's how I understood, that's how I negotiated and, strategized ki main forensic sciences I'll do, but I will be able to study psychology also. So that's when I got into, I finished my graduation in forensic sciences and with a major part of it being forensic psychology. However, in 3 years of studying forensic sciences, I got interested in criminology and justice. And criminology comes from 2 branches. It can stem from social sciences and it can stem from medical sciences as well, or sciences or clear sciences that you call it. So my interest grew in social sciences because of the fact that I could do more different things than I would if I entered it from a scientific perspective. And when I started researching on how do I get into criminology and how do I study criminology itself, so I came across Tata Institute, and they have a course in Masters in Social Work in Criminology and Justice. I applied for it, and God knows how I got through it, because it's difficult to get into TISS. The entrance is quite something. So I got selected. Let me be honest, when I entered TISS, the first semester was when I wanted to leave college again. Like, I don't want to study this, because I was a science student getting into social sciences, which I had never studied. And 6 months was like first 3 months that was the first semester, was where the entire BA syllabus was retouched upon. So studying political science, studying sociology had come into picture, studying economics, agrarian crisis, all of these things are foreign words to me. You can talk about medias sternum and you can talk about the clavicle to me, I would be able to understand it at that point. But if you talk about agrarian crisis and if you talk about utopian worlds, and these kind of words were very foreign to me, I couldn't understand it. And it sort of brought down a lot of my morale to work or to continue my studies in MSW. I didn't know it would be that difficult. So, but what I did at that point is I took a break. I took a 2-week break from my college, and one of the professors at that point, she spoke to me and she's like, what is it that is troubling you? And I said, I think I do not fit in over here, and this is not the place that I could work. It scares me, and I don't know. People talk in foreign languages over here, which I cannot understand. So she said one thing. She's like, give us a chance for 3 months. Give it this one semester. If you still don't like it, you can leave. So I said, well, okay, I'll give that a chance. I was placed at a health center in the dumping ground of Shivaji Nagar in Mumbai. So this was like the dumping ground that is there in one of the urban pockets of urban slum pockets of Bombay. And right on that was one of the public health centers that were opened up, and an NGO was supporting it. So I was placed for field work over there. When I started working there, I had to work through situations where people were living in those situations. So I'm not someone who glorified that I worked in such a situation, but where, like, the dumping water, the gutter water would be right up to your knee. There were needles around. There were things that were unsanitized, because that was the population that lived there, and you had to work there. When I started working there is when my mind started changing. So because I could see so much that I could do over there. Working with children, especially, like in an urban community of Mumbai, there was child marriage that was being done in that community, not reported. There were so many cases of marital rape that were happening. How women were subjected to violence within their households, and yet could not talk to their own partners about contraception. So they would come to the PHC and take an injection that would help them, help them be protected for the next 1 month, because their husbands refuse to wear condoms. So these things were things that started triggering me, like there's so many problems, like why am I, and I had such a first world problem that, oh my god, this is too difficult to study. That's just not something that I agreed to. And my professor was right. So I continued to study in masters in my in master's social work in criminology and justice, and I um, the innate feeling of being myself is something that a very close person to me said, recently told me that I like to be myself, and being myself is to be there for someone else. So that innate feeling drove me to choose a career in social work, to choose a life that was not necessarily all sacrificial, but it was something that would make a small difference, even if it is to make a difference in people, in one person's life through my life. I would be happy with that. So that itself drove me to choose social work as a profession. I'm still stuck on it, like even if I work on projects that are a part of huge institutes or organizations, I continue to work on cases. I continue to help over phone call. I'm also the social legal advisor to the Plainja Foundation, and we deal with a lot of social legality cases and psychosocial cases every day, and that's where I am. So yeah, that is what drove me to choose a career in social work, especially a career in criminology and justice, because one of my colleagues used to say, you wouldn't want to know your rights until you're a victim. So that I would want people to not be at that level कि victim बनो फिर ही right समझो. So I would like to start with the conversation of let's talk about your rights first. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that there sounds like two pivotal points where there's one where you completing your graduation, you're thinking that sorry, you've completed your junior college and you're thinking that medical sciences is not my thing, and then you're moving on to forensic, and then there is this part where you enter the academic setup in your masters, and when you enter fieldwork is where I think you get familiarized with the work that is going to be done.
Yeah.
And that sounds like an important moment.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you've also spoken about plain jar and your work with the plain jar and working towards human rights. I think we are also kind of approaching the end of the conversation. So I would want to ask two questions. One would be that any suggestions or advices for people who are entering the social work setup or who are maybe working towards human rights activism for that matter? Anything that you have to say to them, even from a psychologist's perspective? I mean, people are, if they're entering from a psychology stream.
Yeah. No. So one thing about social work recently has been that it has I don't know if I should say this or not, but it has been a very elitist space, and it becomes problematic because it comes from perspective of where I want to give to the society because I have so much. Now it again becomes a question. So there is this when we are choosing a career, especially in social work or sciences that involve people, it involves a lot of empathetic approaches. So we cannot say that I want to do social work because I have so many things. We have to understand and how do you say, relate to realities of people and their experiences. We cannot negate them at any point. I cannot go to a rag picker community and say, "She, तुम लोग कितना गंदा काम कर रहे हो," or you could do a better job. Why are you stuck to this? But I need to understand their three generational marginalization for them to be at this point where they are still surviving, they're still working, and this is work. So how it is while we choose a career in social work, I would really insist a lot of mental health professionals to enter social work, because that's where also there is a, how do I call it? There is a collaboration and integration of two sciences that is really needed. in a lot of NGO spaces and CSOs that we have, the civil society organizations that we have very few people with a background in psychology and social work and entering the system itself. So for me, I had my studies in psychology and forensic sciences, did my master's in social work, and very little work in the mental health space, but a lot of work in the social legal space. But it helped me intervene better. My knowledge of psychology, mental health sciences helped me intervene better and helped me support people better. So when you're deciding your career to get into social work, one thing you need to also understand is that the sector does not pay very well, and you have to keep a realistic goal in that. If your goal is to be paid well, which everyone needs to be, but sadly social work is still considered to be a profession that chal jata hai ki you are a social worker, no, so you should work even with the least amount of money, right? So that is one thing one needs to keep in mind, that if you do not have the support that is required to grow a career in social work, it is okay. It is definitely fine. What you could definitely do is, after getting your studies in MSW, you can go on to join corporate social responsibilities, that is CSRs, in various corporates that do pay like well. In your starting of your career, it may not be as well, but they do pay eventually. Apart from that, but I would very, very strongly insist on at least interning with small organizations, because it gives you perspectives that you will not get anywhere else. Like interning with NGOs, interning with CSOs, interning with small community-based organizations helps you understand people, helps you understand issues and concerns at a deeper level that are very superficial in academic writing. Even when you're reading a lot of research paper, academic papers and all, they are results of a certain experiment, or they are results of a certain phenomena. It is different from being there. Definitely a lot of research articles are in depth. I'm not saying that academic writing is not the right thing. You should refer to them. But that plus the experiences on field is something that informs your knowledge more, is what I feel. So when you are studying, see if you can intern at that one organization, not for a period of 6 months, 7 months, or a year. You can intern even for a week or 2 weeks, or say 1 month. That's also good enough experience of working with people. I have a very good friend of mine who's also part of Plain Jar, and she is by far one of the most strongest persons when it comes to social legal expertise. I had trained her under the Plain Jar, and now she turns out to be one of the trainers as well. And she's just 21, 22, and she knows so much more than a lot of development sector professionals. She's also from the mental health profession itself. She's finished her counseling psychology and going on to study a master's. But between her bachelor's and master's, she's worked in multiple places. She's taken internships. She's worked in various projects, understood a lot of aspects that have informed her. And now only when she studies master's, she'll be able to excel in her dissertation, in her research, in her work later on. So one of the main recommendations I would give definitely is to intern, to find spaces where you can find your interest in, and you can intern there. Understand it's hardly an effort to be in such places, and if possible, go to a rural context. Go to not only urban spaces, go to semi-urban, rural context to understand their work. I recently met a person who, after her legal studies, law studies, she went on to intern and work for a year with this one community-based organization in Rajasthan, and she learned so much about employment because they worked on Manrega, so MNREGA, the scheme for employment and housing. So she worked there at one of the community-based organizations. She didn't understand only about employment. She understood about marginalization. She learned about caste. She learned about religion. She learned about gender and the intersectionality between all of them in just a year. And she could write a paper out of it. So it makes sense to only go to such spaces, explore your interests. And if it is not, it is not. It's okay to come back. It's fine. Nobody's going to harm you about it. Nobody's going to pull you up in court for not finishing a year of internship or something like that. But you can definitely explore it. Another thing is also keep a check of what is your interest within social work. Now, social work is made out of a lot of disciplines. We have social work in mental health. Like TIS has a project. TIS has various departments, so various centers. So there's Center for Mental Health, there's Center for Disability, there is a Center for Criminology and Justice, there's a Center for Dalit and Tribal Studies, there is a Center for Special Education, there is a Center for Community-Based Organization, Livelihoods and Social Entrepreneurship. So there are so many centers that you can look at, so many fields within social work that you can look at. So you can research a little bit on where your interest lies, where you think your experiences and your knowledge can imply or apply in, and what you would like to study. So going on that field, you can take up like children. There's another Center for Children and Families. There's a Center for Women's Studies, and there's a Center for Gender Studies. So you can look at what informs your interest and then choose that career, right? And also look at it from a 5 year from now perspective. If from 5 years from now, after finishing my master's, what do I want to do? Do I want to start my own organization? Do I want to be a part of an organization that does such a good work? So how do I look at it? Or do I want to work for 2 years, then get into a PhD program? So you can definitely decide on these things. So always so research a little bit. Definitely you can call me if you need any information on these things, but choose the branch that informs your interest. Do not take it just because you've got it. Take it because it informs your interest, and choose your career accordingly in social work, because there's then it will just be a deflection from your interest area. Now, if you're doing MSW in children and families and you do not get a job in an NGO that works with children, or an organization that works with children, how can you pave your way in another organization that at least to an extent works with children? How do you do that? So these are things that also you need to decide on. And well, that's about it that I can suggest at this point.
Yeah, wonderful. I think you've spoken about interest, internships, awareness, and having humility in the whenever you are in that setup, to be humble and just open to learn, I guess.
More of unlearning rather than learning also. It's more about, because recently when I'm seeing spaces, academic spaces or social work, people are coming from varied backgrounds. Now, when I was in studying my social work, I had people who came from the most marginalized parts, but now sadly that is not so because of the current political situation. But we have people who are coming from a lot of backing. They come from a lot of they have people whom they can support. They have privileges. I was privileged enough to enter an institute like this. So when we are coming from a point of privilege, it is definitely something that we need to unlearn. And how do we empathize, not sympathize, but how do we put ourselves in that place and learn from people? Because the amount of work I've learned from people working in NGOs on field who are just 10th pass or 12th pass but have 15 years of experience of working on field cannot be equated to anything I've learned from 10 or 15 research articles or 100 research articles. So one needs to be aware of that when we are in the field of social work.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Runita. Just I think my last question to you would be, what are your hopes and fears looking at the future, say 5 years from now, or however long, in the sphere of criminology and justice? What are your hopes and fears?
Hope is that systems, I think at least the policing system gets a little better, tad bit 2% better when it comes to accessibility to people. And when it comes to sensitivity, is what I am looking at as one of the major hopes. Secondly, another hope is also to have more people working in the sector, more people. Criminology is a very niche branch of social work that very few people opt to work in. And I hope that there are people who interest themselves in these areas of judicial reforms or human rights or tribal studies or anything to do with rights and approaching the system. So that is one of the hopes, that more people to come within the sector, so that there is, because there's a lot of work to do, and how we need more people who can work in this space. Fear is definitely of the changing political scenario in our country, and it scares me to a point that, there are times when we are all disappointed of why the hell am I working so much, things are just going to fall apart. But one of the fears is also that we may turn towards more rigid judicial forms of justice, where we may not, where one place where certain things are being repealed, there are other places where there are decisions and judgments that are coming that are completely absolutely in harm of human rights itself. So there is a conflict when it comes to judiciary in the country, and that's where my fear is. My fear is that more people are going to be marginalized. My fear is that more people are going to need help, and my fear is that that much help will not be provided to them. So that is where I am at this moment. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Donita. Thank you for giving us your time. I think we can open the conversation to others as well. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask.
I think normally when we have any questions as well, people prefer to not be recorded, so we may have to stop the recording. But it was absolutely amazing hearing from you, Donita, all the work that you have been involved with. And it's been an absolute delight and really, really informative and inspirational, I think, for others as well who have been, because the community that we have consists mainly of students or people who are beginning to enter the mental health field. And we wanted to organize these talks specifically to help them also see what all options, things they can do, may find their passion in, like you said, that you found your heart while doing this. And so this is just an opportunity for all of them as well to kind of connect with people, not just hear what the work is, but also hear your own story as well. To see what challenges to expect for themselves as well, right? So really wanted to thank you on behalf of the ConnectHut and the community as well. But yes, if anyone has any questions, I will be pausing the recording now. So anyone, if there are any questions, feel free to ask. But I do think that it was a very, very detailed and informative session. So guys, if any questions, please feel free to ask. Thank you, Donita, again.